Or wait, give me a second because I'm noticing something as I'm starting this and I don't want to rush past it. Okay. Yeah. This feels familiar. Like I've been here before with this kind of energy. You know, when you're talking to someone and later you realize they were looking at you through the wrong lens the entire time? That's what this feels like. Someone thought they had you figured out early, too early, and they never really went back to check if that first impression was even accurate. I keep coming back to the word underestimated, not in a dramatic way, not like they thought you were incapable. It's subtler than that. It's more like they assumed you weren't tracking everything, like because you weren't reacting or explaining yourself or correcting them, you must not have been fully aware. And I want to say this clearly because it matters. You weren't quiet because you didn't understand. You were quiet because you did. Let me pause for a second. Yeah, that's the part that keeps sticking. Your calm got mistaken for softness. Your restraint got mistaken for compliance. Your silence got mistaken for emptiness. And instead of interrupting that misunderstanding, you let it sit. Not as a strategy, not to be clever. You just didn't feel the need to prove anything. You didn't feel threatened. You didn't feel rushed. And people really don't know what to do with that. I'm picking up on this feeling that they filled in the gaps themselves. They told themselves a story about you that made things easier for them, that made them feel more in control. And once that story locked in, everything you did after that got filtered through it. If you didn't react, it confirmed what they already believed. If you stayed composed, they took it as disinterest or lack of depth. They weren't actually watching closely. They thought they didn't need to. And now, this is where it shifts a little. Because I keep getting this sense of someone looking back, replaying moments, rereading interactions, not panicking, just quietly unsettled. Like something isn't lining up anymore. You didn't do anything new. You didn't announce a change, but suddenly the old assumptions don't fit the present moment. This realization didn't hit them all at once. That's important. It crept in, it showed up as hesitation, as second guessing, as watching you a little more closely than before. Maybe asking different questions, maybe saying less than they used to. It's that internal moment of, wait, did I read that wrong? And once that thought shows up, it doesn't really leave. If I stop and check in again, yeah, there's confusion here. Not loud confusion, quiet confusion. The kind that happens when someone realizes they might have moved too confidently based on incomplete information. And there's no clean way to undo that. No rewind button, no easy reset. The dynamic has already shifted internally, even if nothing's been said out loud. And I want to be clear, this isn't about you winning. This isn't about you getting the upper hand. That's not what this feels like at all. It feels more neutral than that. Almost observational, like you were always just being yourself, and other people were the ones making assumptions. You didn't change. You didn't escalate. You didn't expose anything. You just stayed consistent. Spirit's been kind of nudging this idea that silence can hold a lot of information. Not silence as avoidance, silence as awareness. You were listening while others were talking. You were noticing patterns while others were comfortable with surface level reads. And now there's this quiet recalibration happening around you. People realizing they may have underestimated someone who was paying attention the entire time. If this is already resonating, just take a second to like the video and subscribe. No pressure, but it genuinely helps, and I appreciate you being here. And if you feel like it, drop a short phrase in the comments, 1 or 2 words, whatever keeps echoing for you right now. There are a few specific things I keep circling back to with this energy. Different angles, different moments where the misunderstanding really mattered. I want to slow it down and walk through them one by one, because each piece adds context to the bigger picture. So, the first thing that keeps standing out to me, and it's subtle but it's everywhere once you notice it, is what I'd call the wrong assumption. And I want to talk through this slowly because it wasn't some big dramatic misread. It was small, casual, almost automatic. I'm getting that someone decided who you were very early on, maybe from the way you spoke or didn't, maybe from how calm you stayed when most people would have reacted. And instead of questioning that impression later, they just built on it. They treated it like a solid foundation. That's usually where things go sideways. What I keep picking up on is that your intelligence didn't register because it wasn't loud. You weren't posturing, you weren't correcting people mid-sentence, you weren't explaining your thought process to make others comfortable. And for a lot of people, if intelligence isn't visible in the ways they expect, they assume it's not there, or they assume it's limited, or situational, or dependent on them. And I want to pause here for a second because this part matters. The assumption wasn't that you were incapable, it was that you were manageable, that you'd follow their lead, that you wouldn't challenge the framework they set up, that if something didn't sit right with you, you'd either ignore it or adapt quietly. That's the kind of assumption that feels harmless at first, but it's not. I keep getting this image of someone checking a box mentally, like, okay, I know where they stand. And once that box was checked, they stopped paying attention, they stopped listening closely, they stopped questioning their read. Everything you did after that got interpreted through that initial lens, even when it didn't really fit. So if you stayed quiet, it confirmed what they already thought. If you didn't react emotionally, they saw that as detachment or lack of investment. If you moved carefully, they read it as hesitation. They weren't actually observing you, they were just reinforcing a conclusion they'd already settled on. And what's interesting is I don't get any sense that you benefited from correcting this. It feels like you noticed the assumption, clocked it, and then decided not to interfere. Not because you were playing games, but because you understood something they didn't. You understood that once someone underestimates you, they reveal how they think, they show you how they operate, they show you what they miss. If I stop and check the energy again, yeah, there's almost a quiet curiosity on your side, like you were watching how far the assumption would go, watching how people behaved when they thought you weren't fully aware. And the longer it went unchallenged, the more information you gathered about motives, about limits, about how people move when they think no one's really watching. This wrong assumption didn't just shape how they saw you, it shaped the decisions they made around you, what they shared, what they withheld, what they tried, what they didn't bother protecting. And that's where the cost starts to form, even if no one realizes it yet. Because once actions are taken based on the wrong read, there's no clean way to undo them later. You can't retroactively be careful, you can't unshow your hand, and that's the part that feels irreversible here. Not dramatic, just factual. And this naturally leads into the next thing I'm noticing, because while they were operating off an assumption, something very different was happening on your end. Something quieter, more precise. Because while they were assuming nothing was happening on your end, there actually was. Just not in a way that performs well for an audience. I keep getting this sense of you mentally keeping track of things without making a show of it. Not in a paranoid way, not in a suspicious way, just naturally noticing patterns, noticing inconsistencies, noticing how people's words lined up or didn't with what they actually did later. This feels like internal math. That's the only way I can describe it. Not strategy, not plotting, just processing. Like you were adding things up quietly while everyone else thought the room was empty. And I want to be really clear here because this gets misunderstood a lot. You weren't waiting for a moment to strike. You weren't sitting there thinking 10 moves ahead like it was a game. You were just aware, calm enough to observe, present enough to remember. If this were a card, it'd be one of those that looks almost boring at first. People glance at it and move on. Then near the end of the reading, they realize it explains everything that just happened. That's the energy here. Intelligence that doesn't interrupt, awareness that doesn't announce itself. I keep picking up on how little urgency there was on your side. You didn't rush to respond, you didn't feel pressure to react in real time. And that's where people really got it wrong. They assumed that if you weren't responding immediately, you weren't understanding. But what was actually happening is that you were letting things play out long enough to see the full shape of them. Let me slow down for a second. Yeah. This part feels important. You weren't collecting information because you didn't trust anyone. You were collecting information because you trusted yourself. You trusted your ability to hold multiple pieces of context without panicking, without jumping to conclusions, without needing reassurance from outside sources. And that kind of restraint gets misread constantly, especially by people who think intelligence has to be fast, loud, or reactive. You didn't need to prove anything in the moment. You didn't need to win the conversation. You didn't need to correct the narrative as it was forming. You were comfortable letting the math finish before drawing conclusions. What's interesting is how clean this feels. There's no emotional chaos attached to it, no resentment, no bitterness, just clarity. You notice who contradicted themselves. You notice who over-explained. You notice who changed tone when they thought you weren't paying attention. and you remembered it, that's it. I'm getting this sense that your silence actually gave people more room to reveal themselves. When no one's interrupting, people talk more, they relax, they assume they're safe. And while they were filling the space, you were quietly noting what mattered and letting the rest fall away. And again, this wasn't something you did to anyone, it's just how you operate. You don't need an audience to think clearly. You don't need feedback loops to validate your understanding. You let things settle, you let patterns repeat, and only then do you decide what something actually means. That's why the assumption that nothing was happening on your end was such a miss. Because the silence wasn't emptiness, it was accumulation, it was context stacking, it was you allowing enough information to come in that you didn't have to guess later. And this connects directly to the next thing that's coming through, because at a certain point, you became aware of how you were being perceived and still chose not to correct it. And that's the part I keep circling back to, because it wasn't passive, it wasn't fear, it feels very deliberate, even if you didn't consciously frame it that way at the time. There was a moment, maybe more than one, where you realized, oh, this is how they see me. And instead of rushing to clarify or defend yourself, you paused. You checked in with yourself, and you decided it wasn't necessary. I'm picking up on this sense that explaining would have shifted the dynamic too early, not in your favor, not in theirs, just prematurely. You didn't need validation. You didn't need to be understood right then. And you definitely didn't need to convince anyone of something they weren't actually open to seeing yet. Let me stop for a second. Yeah. This feels like discernment, not avoidance. There's a difference, and you knew it. Avoidance has anxiety attached to it. This doesn't. This feels calm, grounded, like you trusted that clarity doesn't always need an audience. People expect reactions. They expect reassurance. They expect you to jump in and smooth things over, or correct the record, or explain what you meant so they can feel settled. And when you don't do that, it creates a strange kind of tension. Not immediately, later. Because the lack of explanation leaves space, and space makes people think. I keep getting this image of someone waiting for you to say more, waiting for you to defend yourself, waiting for you to clarify so they can file you back into the category they're comfortable with. And you just didn't. You stayed where you were. You let the moment pass without fixing it. And I want to be clear here, this wasn't about control, it wasn't about manipulation, it was about timing. You understood on some level that once you explain yourself, you give people a framework to work with. You show them where you stand, you reveal how you process things, and you weren't ready to do that, or maybe you didn't see the need at all. If I check the energy again, yeah, there's this quiet confidence underneath it. Not ego, not arrogance, just self-trust. You didn't feel destabilized by being misunderstood. You didn't feel erased by it. You knew who you were, and that was enough. What's interesting is how unsettling that becomes later on. At the time, people might have brushed it off. Yeah, they might have told themselves you didn't care, or didn't notice, or didn't have much to say. But the absence of correction lingers. It becomes a question mark, and over time, that question mark gets louder. Because when someone doesn't rush to explain themselves, it forces others to sit with their own assumptions. It removes the safety net. There's no immediate reassurance that they read the situation correctly. And once doubt creeps in, it's hard to push back out. This choice not to correct anything quietly preserved your position. You didn't overexpose. You didn't overcommit. You didn't give away information that couldn't be taken back. You let things unfold naturally without interference, and that's why this moment matters more in hindsight than it did in real time. And this leads into the next thing that's coming through, because after a while that silence starts to get noticed, not as emptiness, but as something people begin paying attention to. And that's when it starts to change. Not in a way you can point to, not in a way anyone announces. It's more like a shift in posture, a difference in how people look at you or don't. I'm picking up on this awareness from the other side now. Very quiet, very contained. People are paying attention in a way they weren't before, but they're not engaging more. If anything, they're engaging less. There's more watching than talking, more listening than reacting, and that tells me something didn't add up for them. The old assumptions stopped fitting the present moment. And instead of correcting it out loud, they're recalibrating internally. Let me slow this down for a second. Yeah. This feels like hesitation, not fear, just uncertainty. the kind that shows up when someone realizes they may have oversimplified something. They're noticing that you're steady in a way that doesn't match the role they assigned you. You're not acting confused. You're not scrambling. You're not trying to regain footing. You're just there. And that's unsettling in its own quiet way. I keep getting this sense of people holding back now, pausing before they speak, choosing their words more carefully, maybe even pulling back slightly as if they're trying to observe without influencing the outcome. They're not confronting you, they're not asking direct questions, they're watching how you move when you think no one's really paying attention. What's interesting is that this awareness doesn't come with clarity, it comes with doubt. They don't suddenly understand you, they just understand that they don't. And that's a very different thing. It forces them out of autopilot. And if I check in again, there's a lot of second guessing here. Replaying interactions, noticing things they dismissed before, small details that didn't register at the time, your tone, your timing, the way you responded or didn't. And now those details feel heavier, like they mattered more than they realized. This isn't confrontation energy at all. No one's stepping forward to address it. It's all internal recalibration, internal discomfort. They're adjusting how they see you without saying it out loud, because saying it would mean admitting the original read was wrong. And the cost hasn't fully landed yet. That part feels important to say. This is still the early stage, the awareness stage, the moment before consequences become obvious. But something has already started moving. Once someone realizes they may have misjudged another person's intelligence, they can't unsee it. They can't go back to treating them the same way. And you're not doing anything differently to provoke this. You're not demanding attention. You're not asserting yourself. You're just continuing to exist as you are. And that consistency is what's forcing the recalibration. This leads into the next piece that's coming through, because there's a very specific moment tied to this shift. A pause, a delay, something that didn't happen when it was expected to. And that moment carries more weight than it looks like on the surface. And it's tied to a pause. That's the best way I can describe it. A moment where something was supposed to happen and it didn't. Someone expected a response, a reaction, movement, and instead there was space, not avoidance, not withdrawal, just nothing filling the gap. I keep picking up on how uncomfortable that pause was for the other side. Not because you did anything wrong, but because the pause disrupted their expectations. They were waiting for you to step into the role they'd assigned you, to clarify, to soften, to adjust. And when you didn't, it forced them to sit with uncertainty longer than they were prepared for. Let me slow down here, because this part matters more than it looks like. Pauses reveal things, they strip away momentum. When everything is moving quickly, people don't have to think, they just react. But when there's a delay, when no one fills the silence, people become aware of their own assumptions. They start noticing what they were relying on without realizing it. I'm getting this sense that someone reached a moment where they expected you to bend or explain or re-engage in a familiar way. And you didn't. You stayed still, grounded. And that stillness didn't give them anything to work with. No confirmation, no reassurance, no correction. That's when the doubt really settled in. This wasn't a dramatic turning point, no confrontation, no fallout, just a quiet shift. The pause made them aware that they didn't actually know how you'd move next. And once someone realizes they don't have you mapped out, they start questioning everything that came before. If I check in again, this pause forced them to face the fact that the original read might have been incomplete. They couldn't lean on it anymore. They had to sit with the possibility that they misjudged your depth, your awareness, your timing. And there's something deeply unsettling about realizing that after you've already acted based on the wrong assumption. What's important here is that you didn't use the pause as leverage. You didn't weaponize silence. You didn't draw attention to it. You just let the moment exist. And that's what gave it weight. It wasn't reactive. It wasn't strategic. It was honest. Silence creates space, and space invites reflection whether people want it or not. That gap became a mirror for them. It showed them where their expectations came from and how fragile those expectations actually were. And once that pause happened, something changed internally for them. Even if nothing was said out loud, even if everything looked normal on the surface, that moment marked the point where certainty started to erode. And this naturally flows into what I'm noticing next, because after that pause, the balance doesn't snap back. It doesn't reset. It starts shifting in a quieter, more permanent way. And what's interesting is that nothing on your end actually changes. That's the part people miss. You don't suddenly speak up more. You don't assert yourself differently. You don't explain anything that you didn't explain before. You stay steady. You stay consistent. But the old assumptions can't hold the situation together anymore, and that's where the reversal happens. I'm picking up on this subtle loss of confidence from the other side, not outwardly, internally. The people who felt comfortable before don't feel quite as sure now. They hesitate, they pause, they rethink how they approach you. Not because you demanded respect, but because their original framework for understanding you stopped working. Let me sit with that for a second. Yeah. This feels inevitable, not dramatic, just logical. Once someone realizes they may have underestimated another person's awareness or intelligence, every interaction after that gets filtered differently. They start questioning their own reads, their timing, their choices, and that internal questioning shifts the dynamic more than any confrontation ever could. You're not gaining power in the traditional sense. You're not taking anything from anyone. You're simply not losing your footing the way they expected you to. And that steadiness becomes the reference point. The confidence they had before begins to thin out because it was built on a misread. This reversal is quiet, almost invisible, but it's real and it's already happened. That's the part that stands out. There's no sense of anticipation here, no waiting for a moment. The shift has already occurred internally for them, even if they haven't articulated it yet. And this leads into something heavier because awareness doesn't always arrive on time. I keep getting this feeling of people realizing things after the window to adjust has closed. Not as a punishment, just as timing. They didn't pause when they could have, you did. They moved confidently when they thought they understood the situation. You waited, and now the realization shows up late. There's a weight to this part, not dramatic, not emotional, just final. The understanding that certain decisions can't be revisited, that certain dynamics can't be reset. They see now that you were always operating with more awareness than they gave you credit for, and that understanding lands when there's nothing left to correct. If I check in again, yeah. This isn't regret in a loud sense. It's quiet, private, the kind that sits with someone long after the interaction's over. They're not confronting you about it. They're not asking for clarification. They're just holding the realization internally, recognizing that they underestimated someone who never needed to announce what they knew. And there's no victory energy here, no sense of you winning. That's not what this is. It's the quiet consequence of moving too fast on an incomplete read. The understanding that intelligence doesn't always show up in the ways people expect. And by the time they recognize it, the opportunity to respond differently has passed. This naturally brings us to the final thing that's coming through, because through all of this, you're still standing exactly where you were. That's what keeps coming through the strongest. There's no sense of you climbing to a higher position or stepping into a spotlight. You didn't level up in some obvious way. You didn't reinvent yourself. You didn't harden or sharpen or shift your personality to survive this. You're just steady, the same tone, the same pace, the same way of moving through things. If I pause and check this again, yeah, this isn't triumph energy, it's stability. You didn't win because you weren't competing. You didn't outplay anyone because you weren't playing. You stayed consistent while the environment around you adjusted to its own miscalculations. And that matters because it means none of this came from intention on your part. You didn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. You didn't plan consequences. You didn't orchestrate an outcome. What's unfolding now is simply the result of assumptions meeting reality over time. That's it. There's something very grounded about this. Almost quiet to the point where it could be missed if someone were looking for drama. You're not waiting for recognition. You're not watching to see who notices what. You're just continuing to live from the same internal clarity you had before any of this shifted. I'm picking up on this sense that something has clicked for you too, but not in a reactive way. More like confirmation, like, okay, I trusted myself correctly. Not in an ego sense, in a settled way. You didn't abandon your instincts. You didn't rush yourself into explaining or adjusting just to ease someone else's uncertainty. And what's interesting is that the weight of what happened doesn't sit on you. It sits elsewhere. You're not carrying the consequences. You're not processing regret or confusion. You're simply present, and that presence feels very clean, uncomplicated. If I slow down here, yeah, there's no need to forecast what comes next, no need to outline outcomes or possibilities. That's not what this moment is about. This is about recognition, internal recognition. The understanding that your way of moving through things wasn't wrong or naive or passive, it was accurate. You didn't need to announce your intelligence for it to exist. You didn't need to prove awareness for it to be real. You trusted your timing and you trusted your perception. Everything else unfolded on its own. And I think that's where this naturally settles. Not with a conclusion, not with a takeaway, just with that quiet understanding sitting where it belongs. If this resonated, take a second to like the video, subscribe, or share it with someone who might need it. And if you feel like it, drop a word or two in the comments. Thanks for being here and sitting with this energy.